Ah, okay. Do you want me to come and have a look? Do you want me to come down?
There's a slight amplification, but not a lot. Are you guys just hearing me natively, or is there a little speaker amplification? Just native, right? So I'm not hearing any.
Yeah, is there a control panel? Is there a control panel down there? Usually it's controlled from the podium.
Testing. No, there you go. How about that? You have a good future in academia. Okay. So are there any questions on the material so far? As usual, any questions? So, in this class, actually, whether you think about it or not, oftentimes we discuss topics that can be seen as sensitive from different segments of the student body. And last time I discussed religion, obviously, which is probably not something a lot of you encounter formally. I mean, some of you are religious studies majors, and of course, maybe you have religious backgrounds, but it's not fashionable in academia to talk about religion, any aspect of religion, frankly. But it's obviously an incredibly important part of people's lives. And it's difficult to talk, just like when we talk about race and some of the other topics, or end of life care. It's difficult to talk about some of these topics sometimes and not, have people be upset. And I certainly didn't mean to upset anybody. And, a lot of times in this class we look at data or evidence that sort of provides conflicting support for different aspects of the situation. You've seen many examples of this. And so yesterday, or the last time, some students may have been upset with the fact that I seem to be ending at the end with all the bad things about religion. But most of the lecture was about the way religion is salubrious, the sort of good aspects or the beneficial aspects of religion, at least insofar as health is concerned. So I didn't mean to suggest that, by any stretch of the imagination, that religion is only a force for evil. I don't believe that. And in addition, I think people have different faiths and different religious backgrounds and different intensities with which they hold their beliefs. And I think that even if that's all of those individuals in an institution like this should still be able to listen to a lecture about religion and its possible biological basis and its biological implications without seeing that discussion of those empirical facts as in any way threatening religious beliefs. So I think it's possible to study religious beliefs scientifically. Where do they come from? What implications do they have? Which was the point of the lecture last time. Are there any questions that anyone wants to ask me about religion? Who's seen the movie? Did I mention this already? The movie Contact? I mentioned this last time? Yeah. All right. So okay. So today I'm going to be making some remarks about income inequality, which is an intrinsically collective socioeconomic measure for property. So socioeconomic inequality is only something we can think of when we think about a group. So I can think about how rich you are or how poor you are, and I can think about how rich this group or how poor this group is. And I can think about how unequally the income in this group is distributed. But I cannot think about how unequally your income is. It doesn't make sense. Inequality is an intrinsically collective property. It's a property of groups. And I want to provide a sort of pivot for a conversation we'll be having about the importance of social support, social networks, and social capital to individual health over the next 5 or 6 lectures. And I want to examine how yet another social structural feature influences the health of individuals. So yet again, something collective, something in the structure in which individuals are embedded that affects their agency and affects their individual health. Now this here is a pretty standard way to chart variation in wealth around the world. So we can just compute per capita GDP. This is for 2003 figures. It really hasn't changed much in the last 10 years. And so the darker countries are the richer countries per capita, and the lighter colored countries, for example, all here sub-Saharan Africa, are the poorest countries in the world. China, of course, is rising dramatically, the next 10 years. I mean, its economy is almost as big as the United States now, but per capita, of course, is still nowhere near where the developed world is. And in fact, not surprisingly, the wealthier the country is, the healthier it is, as shown on this graph. Though this relationship at the country level has a curvilinear shape, such that there is lower marginal, but still increasing return to per capita income at higher incomes. So here on the x-axis, we have the GDP per person based on purchasing power parities that corrects for things about how much a dollar can buy in different countries. So here's how rich the countries are, and here's the average life expectancy of the countries. And so it's monotonically increasing, meaning like the richer the country is, the longer they live, but at a decreasing rate, so it sort of flattens out. So this, up here in this portion of the curve, you're this much richer than this country. It doesn't give you as much bang for your buck as compared to over here. So declining marginal return to wealth at the country level with respect to health. But there actually is another way to look at wealth, one that privileges not how wealthy each country is per capita, but rather how that wealth is distributed within each country. And it turns out that both the absolute level of wealth and the distribution of that wealth might be relevant to health outcomes at various levels of geography, as we're going to see. So, how might we measure inequality and its distribution? So one measure is the so-called Gini coefficient, which we'll come back to. And this shows inequality around the world. And the green countries are the more equal countries, and the red countries are the more unequal countries in the distribution of their wealth. So here these Scandinavian countries are green. You should probably have the intuition that wealth is more equally distributed in Scandinavia. And then you get to these parts of Africa, for example, or Latin America, and there's tremendous inequality in wealth distribution in these parts of the world. This is a totally different map than the map I just showed you about how rich the countries are. This is a measure of the dispersion of how unequal the wealth is in the country. So the question comes, how might you measure the inequality in the distribution of wealth? What would be, in your judgment, a completely unequal distribution of wealth? What would be the most unequal distribution we can imagine? Yes? Yeah?
One person.
Yeah. So one person has all the money, and everyone else has none of the money. That's the most unequal. And what would be, conversely, the most equal distribution of wealth you could imagine? Everyone has the same, right? So we've got two extreme conditions. Just basic intuition can prompt that conclusion. Now, I want to be clear here that so far, we're talking about outcome and not opportunity or desert. I'm not making any claims about whether it's right or wrong for the income to be distributed one way or another. For now, we're just characterizing the distribution. We're saying, okay, it's really unequal if one person has all the wealth and nobody has any other wealth. You may have seen last week there was this, I think it was Oxfam or someone released a kind of summary. The 85 richest people in the world have as much money as half the planet. These 85 richest people in the world have as much money as 4 billion, the bottom 4 billion people on the planet. So that's approximately quite unequal, right? That's like one person has all the money, no one else has any of the rest of the money. This distribution that I just summarized, at least on the planetary scale, is maybe unequal, is unequal in terms of distribution. It may be unwarranted is another question. So here's one way that inequality could be quantified. This is the so-called Gini coefficient. Let me explain to you how this computation works. So we're going to want to develop a number. I'm not going to test you on this computation, but I want you to understand the intuition behind the computation. So you don't have to do all this math. You need to understand the basic idea, which is that we're measuring equality. So we want a number between 0 and 1 that summarizes how unequal income is distributed. So 0 is going to correspond with perfect equality, where everyone has the same income. And 1 is going to correspond with perfect inequality, where one person has all the income and everyone else has 0 income. And what we're going to do, algebraically, is we're going to take half, and I'll explain in a moment what this is, half the arithmetic average of the sum of the absolute differences between all pairs of incomes in a population normalized to the mean income. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at my income, and we're going to look at your income, we're going to take the difference between you and me. And then we're going to look at my income and your income, take the difference between you and me, the absolute difference, and my income and your income, and continue, xi, I'm the I, each of you takes turns being the j, and we're going to compute the difference in income between me and every one of you, and then we're going to average that for me. And that's the average difference of my income to all of your incomes. Do you understand so far? Then we're going to step to the next person, and we're going to do it for you. The average difference between you and everyone else. And then we're going to average across both of those. So it's the average of the average differences that we're going to compute. And that's all these little summation things say. And then you divide it by 2 times n squared. That's because it gets divided by n once, and then n a second time, n squared. And then it gets normalized to the mean income so that it scales from 0 to 1. Okay? That's the basic intuition. We're just computing the difference between each person and everyone else. And the bigger the difference between each person and every other person across all people, the more unequal the income is distributed. Again, you don't need to memorize this formula. I'm not going to test you on this formula, but I do want you to understand the notion of income inequality. And typically, this type of equation is used to measure income inequality, but it can also be used to measure distribution on any axis, such as inequality in education, or inequality in height, or inequality in age, or something else. Now, whenever we compute income inequality in education, I always tend to aim at the distribution because I spent my whole life in school. After college, I went to medical school, and I got an MPH, and I got a PhD. So it's not common that I encounter someone that's been in school longer than me, although I have one grad student right now that's getting 2 PhDs. Right? But it's very common that I encounter people that make more money than I do. Okay, so you can be in the top end of one distribution and in some different location in another distribution, and you can compute inequality with respect to multiple different traits. Now, another way to describe the income distribution is to use something known as a Lorenz curve. Now, how many of you have seen this before? So some of you have taken economics, you've seen it. Again, you don't. Well, I mean, you should understand how Lorenz curve works, but just descriptively. Let me walk you through it. So on the x-axis here is the deciles of households, 10% of households, 20% of households, up to 100% of the households. And on the x-axis is the proportion of total income. So what the line of perfect equality says is that the bottom 10% of the households have 10% of the income, and the bottom 20% of the households have 20% of the income, and so forth and so on, until you get to 100% of the households have 100% of the income. If at every step along the way you linearly moved up the income percentage, that would be the line of equality, that would be a perfect distribution of income. Okay? Conversely, if you had nobody has any money, the bottom 10% have no money, the next 10% have no money, no one has any money, you get the last guy, and he has all the money, you get a flat line here and then a spike up at the end. So that would be perfect inequality in this situation. I go through you, do you have any money? No. Do you have any money? No. Do you have any money? No. And I get to him, he has all the money, so as I move along the distribution of income, no one has anything, and then suddenly the last person has everything. That would be the perfect inequality. And of course, not surprisingly, true distributions of income, known as the Lorenz curve, fall somewhere in between those two extremes. And in fact, every point on the Lorenz curve represents a statement like the bottom 20% of all households have 10% of the total income. So here you might say the bottom 20% of all households actually is closer to 5% in this figure, and you have to get to the bottom 30% before you get 10% of the income. So the bottom 5%, the bottom 20% have got 5% of the income. The bottom 50% have less than 20% of the income. Of course, when I get to the bottom 100%, by definition, they have to have 100% of the income. Raise your hands if you understand Lorenz curves better now than you did before. And in fact, it turns out that you can also look at the Lorenz curve, and there's a kind of relationship between the Lorenz curve and the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient is the ratio of the area between the line of perfect equality and the Lorenz curve, and the area underneath the Lorenz curve is B. So A over A plus B gives you the Gini coefficient. Okay? So if A is very, very small, income is very, very equal. A is small over A plus B, it approaches 0, right? So you have total equality. And if A is very, very large and B is small, this number tends to 1, and you have a high equality.
Does the Lorenz curve represent the actual data for the population, or is it a model that is very, very...
You can compute the Lorenz curve there. You can either imagine theoretical Lorenz curves. Say it again?
So it changes.
Yeah, it will vary from exactly. Very good. So, and the Lorenz curve gives you more information than this Gini coefficient, which is the single number. Okay. Now, it turns out that the Gini coefficient and the Lorentz curve, which are related, are just one of many ways you could imagine quantifying inequality. Another measure of inequality is known as the Robin Hood index. You may encounter this in your readings at some point. The Robin Hood index approximates the share of total income that has to be transferred from households above the mean to those below the mean to achieve equality in the distribution of income. So you take from the rich and give to the poor, how much you have to take from the rich and give to the poor. And the more you have to take, the more unequal the society is, the higher the Robin Hood index. And that is equivalent to the maximum vertical distance between the Lorentz curve and the line of perfect equality. You don't need to know this, but just so you see, if you already know something about the Robin Hood index, you can compute this vertical distance, and this, and this, and this. Oops, there's the biggest one right there. And then it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. That distance captures or is related to the Robin Hood index. And there are other kinds of ways you can quantify inequality. For example, the proportion of total income earned by the bottom 50%, or other percentages, and so forth. Now, income inequality in the United States, as measured by the Gini coefficient, has varied across time. So these are older data. In fact, it's gotten worse since then. But this paper was just published a few years ago now. These data take time to accumulate and be distributed. Here's the Gini index on the far left. Here's the time on the bottom, and it's from 1925 to 2000. And there are sort of different measures that were available back earlier in this period of time. This shows the share of the top fifth in personal income. But anyway, the bottom line is that there's this kind of U-shaped curve here, where inequality was very high in the time of the robber barons in the 1920s in the United States and our country. Income was very unequally distributed. And in the 1970s, it kind of becomes our most equal that we've been in the last century or more, and now it's been skyrocketing. In fact, right now, income inequality is worse in the United States, I think, than it's, well, I wouldn't say it's ever been, because I don't know, but it's certainly worse in the United States than it's been for over 100 years. So there's a very, very high level of income inequality in our society right now, rivaling or surpassing even the Gilded Age in the time of the robber barons. And in fact, even among wealthy countries, there's tremendous variation in how wealth is distributed. And the wealthy are not the same everywhere. This slide shows the CDO pay as a multiple of average employee in 2004. So you compute, well, how much does the average CEO make? And you divide that by how much does the average worker make. In the United States, that number is 530. We pay our CEOs over 500 times more than the average worker. But if you go to other countries like Britain, Canada, France, Germany, and Japan, it's nowhere near as much. So even in these other rich countries, when we compare ourselves to them, we are very unequal in how we distribute income in our society. And rich people in our society are much, much richer than rich people in other societies compared to the average. Also, absolutely. And in fact, inequality varies not just across time, but also across space. And this graph shows the relation between the proportion of total household income received by the less well-off 50%. So it's no longer the Gini measure, it's this other measure, how much money, the fraction of income is received by the poorest half of the population, so that's our measure. Of the population by state, adjusted and mortality, the relation between Gini coefficient and mortality adjusted for age. So here on the y-axis is a measure of inequality. So these are the more unequal states. I'm sorry, these are the more equal states. Proportion of total household goes up. These are the more equal states. And on the left is the age-adjusted mortality per 100,000 people. So you see, for example, here's Louisiana and Mississippi, very unequal income, very high mortality. Here's New Hampshire and Utah, relatively more equal income and lower mortality. So there seems to be a negative relationship. The more unequal the income is, the more equal the income, the more higher percentage means has more money. The bottom half. So the more equal the income is distributed, the lower the age-adjusted mortality, the longer people live. Everyone with me still? Okay. But if you look at these data, I might say to you, well, you know, what's going on here is that I might say, well, maybe there's a causal relationship between income inequality and longevity in this population. Look at here, Utah and New Hampshire, they are doing better. They have lower mortality because they have more equal income. And what might you say to me in response to that? That might say, well, wait a minute, that might not be the whole story. What else might be going on? Yeah, I forgot your name. I'm Obuda. Obuba.
In Utah, isn't there like a higher
Higher what? Mormon population, yeah. So maybe there's something that Mormons have known, as we discussed in the last lecture, have very good health behaviors. Maybe that's what's explaining it. But what about New Hampshire? It's not a high Mormon population in New Hampshire. Small data set. Small data set might explain noise, but it's not going to sort of explain. It could be just a chance that we have this event, but I don't think that's what's happening. Yeah.
It could just be a better government that regulates equality better and then therefore might provide better health care.
Yeah. So there might be better government in those states. That's a good possible explanation. Yeah, Sean.
Inequality might show discrimination rather than something that means the other effects.
Yeah, so there could be other things like government and discrimination, but that's not where I'm headed. What else is obviously different about Louisiana and Mississippi when we're thinking about income and the other states at the other end of the distribution? Yeah?
Industries are
There could be industries, there could be like toxic industries in those states that are killing off people or other kinds of things. Yeah, Amelia?
the states with more unequal income could just be poorer states.
Yeah. So one obvious thing could be that maybe they're just the richer states, right? Maybe this has got nothing to do with inequality. Maybe there's some relationship between inequality and wealth, and maybe what's really the explanation here is that Louisiana and Mississippi are just poor, and that's why mortality is high in those states. So at a minimum, in addition to all the other points that all of you correctly made about industry and government and norms in the states and so forth, at a minimum, we need to think about the actual wealth of those states if we're going to try to make some kind of a statement about the relationship. And so one question that arises from the following, so now let's say you look at data like this and you might wish to claim that being in a state or in an area, net of the wealth of the area, that has the more unequal distribution of the wealth, that might be associated with worse health. Data like this might suggest. But one question that immediately arises from this is that is everyone in the unequal areas being harmed, or just those at the bottom? Maybe the rich people in the unequal areas, maybe they're not being harmed by it. So maybe your individual wealth is also an important factor, not just the collective wealth, but the individual wealth of the individuals. And the general answer is, and this is a complicated and contested literature, but I think I can summarize it fairly, and I'll show you some more in just a moment. The general answer is that unequal income and hierarchy may not be bad just for those at the bottom. They may also be bad for those at the top. And this is very contested hypothesis, and this observation appears to matter as well by the level of geography that we're looking at, as we're going to see in just a minute. So what do we mean when we talk about an effect of an area that surrounds you? If I want to say there's something about being in Louisiana or Mississippi that's bad for you, what do I mean when I say that? Well, I have to clarify my thinking, and this is an important idea which we'll also return to in a few lectures, about the difference between compositional and contextual effects of local areas. So one thing we might want to say is that the area composition matters. This is the difference that people make to places. The difference that people make to places. An alternative idea is that area context matters. This is the difference that places make to people. Suppose, for example, that neighborhood A has twice the mortality rate of neighborhood B. What if, in fact, everyone in neighborhood A was old? Maybe that would explain the difference. Maybe A has greater mortality than B, not because there's anything toxic about being in A, but because the people who reside in area A are simply older. That's a compositional effect. We want to take that out before we look at contextual effects. We want to understand how context affects individuals. So income inequality is an intrinsically contextual effect, as we opened with at the beginning, but maybe the people who live in more unequal areas are different in other ways. Maybe they're just poorer, and we need to account for that as well. So even though it is the case that inequality is an intrinsically contextual measure, and cannot relate to doesn't arise from the composition, we still have to take into account the composition of the area if we're going to make a statement about how this contextual effect is relevant to the individuals in that part of the country, for example, or a whole country, so catch more. People understand that. So the question becomes, does living in more unequal circumstances affect the health of individuals? Now, initial work in this area was purely ecological, like the studies I just showed you, the graphs I just showed you, looks at the association at the area level. People who live in this unequal area, they have poor health. Maybe there's a relationship between the two. The initial work was just like that, ecological work. But more recent studies have used superior designs involving both individual and contextual measures nested one in the other. And here are some results from a particularly well-conducted study, which is taken from your reading, assessing how state-level inequality, net of individual income, and other factors can harm people. And this is a study that looked at people residing just in the continental United States. So it involved over 500,000 people, aged 18 to 74, who lived in 48 states in the period of time from 87 to 94. And those people were followed an average of 5 years. And during that time, nearly 20,000 of them died. And it looked at individual level family income, grouped into 27 categories, adjusted for inflation and for family size. And then it measured state-level Gini categories, which it put in five groups. High, very high, high, medium, low, very low inequality in the states. And then it included a variety of other so-called covariates or measures controlling for the age, race, sex, marital status, state level of the individuals, and also state level poverty, how much poorer are the states, and the median income of the states. Okay? So we're going to try to assess how bad is it for you to live in an unequal state where income is unequally distributed, after taking into account other features of the state, such as how rich the state is, and also after taking into account things about you, your marital status, your income, your age, and so forth. Because we don't want to make the mistake of saying people who live in this unequal state are dying, and maybe it's just that they're older. You want to control for the age of the individuals. And when they do that, they find the following. This shows income inequality and individual mortality risk from the data. Let's start with the bottom part of the panel. This looks at family income. And the people that were at the top end of the distribution, their risk of death is set at 1. And people, as they get poorer, get higher risks of death. So if you're rich, you have the standardized risk of death. You have no excess risk of 1. If you're very poor, you've got 2.69 is your relative risk, or over twice, nearly 3 times as likely to die because of your poverty than compared to being the high category. Okay? But now let's look in the same model, the same statistical model, the level of the state level Gini coefficient. And here we're going to set the relatively more equal states as lower, and they have this relative risk. And as the inequality rises, we find that there's a subtle but monotonically increasing rise in the probability of individuals dying. So it is clearly the case that your own income matters more than the income of the people around you, or than the inequality of the income distribution. But it's also the case that net of your own income, there seems to be an effect in the sample of 500,000 people of how unequal the income around you is on the individuals. And just to benchmark this, these are Gini coefficients for United States. Less than 34, less than 0.34 is like Scandinavia or Japan. So these are sort of Japan and Scandinavia. Income is relatively more equally distributed. And up high towards the end here, that's like Morocco or Australia, actually. That's very high income inequality. So everyone would be still. And I can even punch this point home even more. This is also I can take it for your readings. By looking at income inequality and individual mortality by income category. So let's look at, for example, the people who are near poor. This is so all of these individuals are near poor. And then we're going to look at, well, what is their death rate per 100,000 person years according to the inequality in the states of the inequality in the distribution of income of the people around them in the state they inhabit. And you see there's this kind of upward sloping line. So you're more likely, if you're near poor and you live in a state with more equal income, so you have a death rate of 625 per 100,000 person years. Whereas if you have more unequal income, you have more than 20% higher, 817. Death rate of 817 per 100,000 person years. This upward sloping line here within this income category. And the same thing is observed here in the middle income category. Now, in the high income category, the line would appear to be flat. And similarly, the poor category, also roughly flat. Why do you guys think that is? Why might the lines be flat at the tails of the distribution of income? Any ideas? Rachel?
For the poor side, none of them have enough money, so it's not like some of them aren't able to get better healthcare, and on the wealthy side, none of them could improve it further.
Okay, you're almost there. So it's a good proposal. First of all, by now in the class, I'm hoping you're recognizing that access to healthcare isn't necessarily the thing that's going to make you better or worse. But there's something about the poor which is going to make them less sensitive to this structural feature, right? Anyone want to embellish that idea? There was another hand that went up here. Come on, guys. Yeah.
I think if you're near poor or middle income, then you're right on the cusp of being able to get the resources that you need. So depending on how inequal societies or inequal the income distribution is, and if it's more equal, then it's being that close, you're more likely to be able to get the whole resources. But then if it's more equal society, then even though we have all the stuff, maybe simply social divide, more equal, more people, that maybe that goes so.
Okay, so you're highlighting one mechanism by which inequality of individuals might affect inequality in the distribution in which an individual finds him or herself might affect their ability to achieve their objectives, in this case to be healthy. We'll come back to that mechanism, but you're still not nailing why it would be flat here. Other ideas? Yeah? Okay.
Because the difference between the poor, between them to themselves is not the
Say that again?
Because the difference of relevance in the rich.
Okay, so I'm not comparing the poor to the rich, but all of you are on something. You're grasping something that there's something about being poor and about being rich that may insulate you from what's happening in the world around you. Okay? So, yeah, in the back there.
Maybe the middle society, so people who are in the middle and see like capitalism and like kind of moving more out of where they get out of what you're if you're very rich or if you're very awesome to move up. So you're on.
Okay, good idea, but also, you guys are all getting down to the mechanism, but first I want you to explain kind of first order observation, which is why it might be the case that if you're poor, it doesn't matter whether you live in an equal or unequal state. Yeah?
Because the state income inequality is measuring the difference between like the rich and the poor, regardless of how equal your state is, the poor are still at the bottom of that and the rich are still at the top.
Correct. You're poor. You're just not sensitive to all the stuff that's happening. You know, you're really poor. So that's the main thing that determines what happens to you. And conversely, at the other end, for a different but similar reason, if you're very rich, you also don't give a damn about what's happening around you, right? You can still afford to get for yourself whatever is required or you need. So the argument, this is a kind of very interesting kind of situation where it may be the case that inequality in the distribution matters most for the people in the middle of the distribution. And in a very weird way, the very rich and the very poor, for different reasons, may be less sensitive to inequality. Now here's some results from a completely different study, from another investigation. These show that within every level of individual income, living in a United States state with more inequality is associated with worse health. Almost identical to what I just showed you. Here, however, measured as maternal depression. So the outcome here is maternal depression, not survival. And so looking at the individual level income, we see that in all 5 of these categories, there's this upward sloping. So here are the Gini coefficients yet again. Here's the percent of depressive symptoms among mothers. This was a paper published in the Medical Journal. So you get this upward sloping line. It flattens out near the top here. It's still upward sloping, even in the richest part of the population. Okay? So this would be suggestive evidence that maybe it works across the whole distribution, at least with respect to this outcome. But as I noted earlier, however, the results about the effect of income inequality are in fact sometimes mixed. These are data from still another investigation, here of nearly 10,000 people nested within 60 metropolitan areas in the United States. And these investigators obtained self-reports of various common chronic medical conditions, and they examined how local income inequality, net of individual income and other traits, was associated with these health conditions. And they found very little evidence, if any, for an effect of income inequality. There's flat sloping in all of these. So this shows fifths of income inequality, so the lowest inequality to the highest inequality. How much do people report pain, or hypertension, or diabetes, or heart disease, or whatever, or here gynecological problems and lung disease, and it's pretty flat in all of these. You understand? So this study, looking at the city level, and looking at and these health outcomes, and the prevalence of the health outcomes, find, and controlling for income, found not a lot of variation in this particular study. So the Subramanian and Kawachi review that was in your reading suggests that this is still an open question. But there are some interesting generalizations that they come to. There's still an open question about whether income inequality harms individuals or not. They point out that there are more findings in the United States than there are from abroad. They find more findings at state level rather than at other levels. For instance, this study here is at metropolitan city level, and the last two studies, and there have been hundreds of these studies, so I just picked 3 to show you. The last 2 studies were at the state level. Those studies seem to show an effect, whereas the city level study didn't seem to show an effect. So Subramanian and Quachi say, look, it seems to be a pattern. We see at higher levels of aggregation, we seem to see more effects. And this observation suggests a possible mechanism, which, picking up on the points that some of you were making earlier, may have to do with state-level policies. So maybe it's something about policy making at the state level that may be relevant to this effect. Yeah, what was your name again?
Rachel.
Rachel, yeah, 2 Rachels right there. Okay.
Would part of this be that when you're looking at these health conditions and relying on self-reports, the poorer are less likely to report these conditions if you can't, if someone dies, that's going to be reported no matter what?
There's absolutely a sense in which something like that could be happening, where if you live in poor, it's like if I walk with a cane and I'm old, like the example we talked about, the young man who injured himself a few weeks ago, if I walk with a cane and I'm old, it seems normal. Everyone has a cane. So if I live in an area where everyone has asthma or gynecologic problems or hypertension, maybe even though I have it, I'm less likely to self-report it. So maybe something about the subjectivity of the data. But I don't think that's what's really going on here. But it could be. And I'm sure critics of this paper probably make the same point that you just made. Yeah. What's your name?
Anna?
Anna?
I was just going to say that diagnostically also, the poor are less likely to know if they have some of these.
It could be, but again, that's also a good idea. But remember here, what we're interested in is not how the poverty level is affecting whether you have these things. It's how unequal the income around you is that's affected. So I can actually measure the inequality you experience without ever speaking to you. I can look at the income distribution in the state where you live or the city where you live, for example. Other ideas. So Subramanian and Quachi's a really nice review, summarizes this whole area. Now, we still haven't though discussed how it might be that social inequality might affect individuals. So there are 3 classes. This is important. There are 3 classes of explanations that link income inequality to individual health. One broad class of explanations is known as the neo-material environmental explanation. And that says there's something about the material environment around you, and by neo we mean modern environment, we're not talking about our Pleistocene environment, that helps explain how inequality might affect your health. Something maybe about differential social spending. Maybe at the state level, they're spending less money on the welfare of citizens in unequal states. Maybe a neglect of the common environment or the commons. Maybe in unequal environments, people don't care about the commons. They don't care about air pollution. They don't care about green spaces, for example. Maybe an underinvestment in human capital in unequal states, or maybe lower social capital in unequal states. These are ideas we'll come back to, especially the social capital idea. So it may be the case that egalitarian societies make more investments in the common good. There might be more investments in infrastructure that's used in common, like trauma centers or techniques for reducing pollution. Maybe in an equal society, we say, we're all in this together. Let's invent ways to keep the air clean. Right? Let's keep the air clean because we're all in it together. Or we say, we're all in this together. We don't know who's going to need a trauma center. So let's collectively build trauma centers for anyone in need, rather than if you're a very wealthy person and you just build a trauma center in your mansion. Okay? Just for you, right? So we say, okay, we're all in this together, we're going to do this together. Or there might be greater investment in other public goods, such as public education or library books, or even maternal health that benefit everyone, rich and poor alike. And a more egalitarian society might have less crime, and so fewer rich people might get shot. So that might be a way in which greater equality benefits people at the top of the distribution. And there might be the development of so-called social capital, a very important idea that I'll return to at length in a few lectures. Or as Lynch and all argue, and I think the readings for today, income inequality might be associated with educational and medical expenditures per capita, and these types of things might in turn have cumulative effects that harm people or benefit them over the lifespan. So that's the neo-material explanation. The second set of arguments, however, focuses on environmental processes of which there might be 2 types. So these are the psychosocial environment explanations. So now it's not the material aspects of the environment, but the psychosocial aspects of the environment that affect you. And I'll explain this in a moment. And that in turn might affect you in 2 different ways. It might have direct physiologic effects. Being in an unequal environment might be stressful for people, so it affects your biology, or it might have psychological effects. So being in an unequal environment may harm you if you look around you and you feel bummed because of what you see around you. And I'll explain this in just a moment as well. So inequality might work, in fact, by these psychosocial means. And we're going to consider this at length next time, but there are psychosocial processes that may damage health, such as a sense of relative deprivation, or erosion of social bonds, or latent social conflict or hostility or resentment that harms everyone. In other words, income inequality might produce adverse effects inside people's bodies and not just outside people's bodies, as in the neo-material explanation. So in the neo-material explanation, something about the inequality changes the world around you, outside your body, and in the psychosocial explanation, something about the income inequality changes something inside you, your physiology or your mental status. And these mechanisms might reinforce each other, of course, and they also may operate at different levels of geographic aggregation, larger and smaller, respectively. So it may be that the neo-material explanation works at the state level. So, for example, state taxation policies affect everyone. But the psychosocial explanation may vary at the tiny level. Like you might compare your income to the people in your entryway, but the clean air, the air you breathe, you don't just compare that to the people in your entryway. That might be a citywide measure or a statewide measure. You see, those things might occur at different levels. And in fact, income inequality over smaller areas might have either more or less of an effect than inequality over larger areas for a variety of reasons we'll discuss. And the third explanation is the so-called individual income explanation, which I'll come to in just a few slides, which says that this relationship between inequality and health is an artifact of the way income is computed. So first, let's consider the psychosocial explanations. Yes, Amelia.
So what is another explanation, though, would be that if you're in a society that has more income inequality, that means that you just have more poor people, because the inequality means that there are a lot of poor people and very few
Yes.
people, right? So then if there are more poor people, then you have more poverty, so you have more people getting sick, right? So then because that average, because there's so many people getting sick now, the average is going to be skewed towards the side of people who are getting sick, so you can see higher mortality rate.
Okay, so I think you are giving a prose description of the third explanation, which I'll come back to in just a moment. However, if you're not getting a description of the third explanation, there may be a different kind of confusion or issue in what you're saying, which is, remember, what we're interested in here is net of your income. So we're saying, given that you are poor, you're absolutely right, with more inequality there can be more poor people, but two societies with equal average wealth, one which has a wide distribution, one which has a narrow distribution, we're going to compare individuals at the same point in the distribution and ask what is their fate given the total distribution. So net of your, so poor people in both societies, we're going to compare them head to head. So it's not that they are poor, it's that they are poor and are facing an unequal environment around them. I think this will become clear. So we know, so you know that you know the feeling you get when you walk past first class to get your economy seat. You guys have been boarded a plane from the front of the plane. Yeah, raise your hands. You walk past first class. How do you feel? It sucks, right? You're walking by. I mean, here it is. This is the seats. You walk by these seats, and then you get your, it's a cattle class way back here compared to what these guys are experiencing in the front. And it's annoying, and it may make you feel envious, but the feeling passes. And the question is this the psychosocial aspect that harms you during your flight? Is this why you were harmed during your flight? Or is it that you feel less rested when you arrive? And is this why you feel less rested when you arrive than the fortunate first-class travelers? So if you look at the end of the flight, you can compare the economy travelers to the first-class travelers. Why are the economy travelers in worse moods and worse off? Is it that they're sitting back in the cattle class and thinking, oh, those people in first class are having such a good time, and this makes me miserable? Or is it something else that's harming them about being in economy class? For example, the material conditions of economy class. Maybe they have less room. Maybe they're less able to get sleep. Maybe they have more noise. We know the air is less fresh in the back of the plane because the fresh air comes from the front of the plane and moves back. That's one of the reasons there's more moisture and it's the air is fresher up in the front, or maybe they just have worse food in economy class. So all these material conditions are worse in economy class than in first class, and it's that material aspect of the experience, not the psychosocial aspect of being aware of the existence of the first class that's causing the problem. Now this distinction is incredibly important because it has incredible relevance to public policy. Under the psychosocial interpretation, these health inequalities that have arisen during this flight would be reduced by abolishing first class, right? So we're really upset about what's happening in our society. Let's just get rid of first class. Everyone will be better off if we do that. Or another alternative might be we could give therapy to those that are not in first class. We can say, okay, so our strategy is going to be, we're going to target therapy for the people in economy class and sort of get them to accept the fact that there's first class, that they don't have to walk through that. But if in fact it's not psychosocial, the way inequality is harming you, but material, neo-material, therapy is not going to help you. If your problem is that you don't have fresh air in economy class, giving you therapy is not going to fix the problem. So from a neo-material viewpoint, we would need to upgrade the conditions in economy class if we're going to solve the problem. So, but it's also the case that other sorts of effects could obtain beyond those that we just discussed, although they could have different magnitudes. So the two different psychosocial and neo-material explanations for how inequality harms the health of these travelers have different implications. And if it was something to do with the kind of psychosocial thing, one idea might be we can say, oh, we'll just abolish first class. And you might think that's ridiculous, but actually some people have proposed this. So lest you think that abolishing first class is a crazy idea, take a look at this story from a year or so ago. This is for, this could only happen in Sweden. Lunch ladies slammed for food that is, quote, too good. So, and so this is a story from 2012. A talented head cook at a school in central Sweden has been told to stop baking fresh bread and to cut back on her wide-ranging veggie buffets because it was unfair that students at other schools didn't have access to the unusually tasty offerings. So, and here's how the story continues. Annika Eriksson, a lunch lady at school in Falun, was told that her cooking was just too good. Pupils at the school had become accustomed to feasting on newly baked bread and an assortment of 15 vegetables at lunchtime, but now the good times are over. The municipality has ordered Eriksson to bring it down a notch since other schools do not receive the same caliber of food and that this is unfair. From now on, the school's vegetable buffet will be halved in size and Eriksson's handmade loaves will be replaced with store-bought bread. Her traditional Easter and Christmas smorgasbords may also be under threat. Parents and pupils alike find the municipality's orders distasteful. Fourth graders at the school have even launched a petition in protest against the decision to put a lid on Eriksson's passion for cooking. So this strikes us as silly, right? But you must know where I'm going with this. Because this is exactly the tension that we face when we look at the inequality in the society. And if you think it's primarily the psychosocial problems, you might want to have, let's say, regressive taxation on the very wealthy, right? Have income transfers. But if you think it's the neo-material conditions, you might still want taxation, but you might use the money to bring everyone up. So instead of like going to Ms. Eriksson and saying, you know, stop doing such a good job for your students, instead you say, okay, we hire more Erikssons and provide them at all the schools, lift everyone's game. This may of course cost money, but it guides you in your policy approach, given what you think about what the cause of the problem is. Incidentally, a postscript to the story that was sent to me last year by a student from Sweden was that in fact, eventually the school relented and Ms. Eriksson was allowed to continue providing her good lunches to the fourth graders here at school. So let's consider now the last explanation, which I think Amelia may have been alluding to. So we introduced the new material thing. We're going to come back to the new material one next time a little bit. We've talked about the psychosocial one in more length today. We're going to return to that as well, but you have a good understanding, I hope, of the psychosocial explanation of how income inequality might be translated into health, bad health. So for example, you feel depressed because you walk through first class and that bums you out, or you are exposed to like worse conditions. And last, a kind of technical thing which we won't return to in the future, but which is important that you understand because it's hotly debated among scientists studying this problem, is the so-called individual income explanation. So let's imagine that you could draw a relationship between socioeconomic status and health. So for example, we're going to put SES on the x-axis and health on the y-axis. And you want to look at this, at the shape of the relationship between those two parameters. One possibility is that it's a step function. That, everyone's health is bad until they reach a particular level of socioeconomic status, and then bang, it goes up, and then thereafter it's flat again. So if you have this minimum amount of income, then you get the maximum amount of health. Otherwise, you get the minimum amount of health. So just a step function in this relationship. And it would be, this type of a function is entirely plausible. It's not crazy to imagine that this could be the state of the world. Once you could afford basic necessities, your health would no longer suffer. Or another possible relationship is that it's a linear relationship. So X dollars more gives you Y amount of health more. Just Y equals MX plus B. Very straightforward relationship. For each additional dollar that you have in income, you get some increment in health across the entire distribution. Or, of course, it could be like this, which is how it is. This is the reality of the situation. So in fact, the shape looks like this. Socioeconomic status here again on the x-axis, health on the y-axis. It's a kind of monotonically increasing, it's always increasing, but with a progressively flatter slope as you go up. So declining marginal returns to income in health. So just like we opened the lecture today looking at the country level, the same shape of the relationship applies at the individual level. As you get more and more wealth, your health constantly improves, but as you get richer and richer and richer, the extra health benefits you get smaller and smaller and smaller. So this kind of curvy linear relationship. Now, a very fundamental reason that the health of a population might depend not only on the average income of the population, but also on the inequality of income in the population is as follows. And the intuition is very straightforward, but this is very important to understand this intuition. For each additional dollar of income that an individual, each additional dollar of income at the individual level raises individual health by ever smaller amounts, we said. So starting from, for any distribution, taking $100 away from person A and giving it to person B reduces A's health and raises B's health. But because of the diminishing returns to income in the production of health, A's health falls by less than B's health rises. So look at this example here. Here we have income on this axis and health on this axis. Imagine, and so mu is the average income in the population, and at that average income, H1 is the average, HO is the average health. Now we're going to take this rich person here, who has this level of health, and we're going to take $100 away from this rich person. So now their income is going to go to Y sub A minus $100, and we're going to transfer it to this poor person's income here. And so this person's income is going to go from Y sub B to Y sub B plus 100. When I take $100 away from a rich person and give it to a poor person, what happens to the average income in the population? Same. Doesn't change. Take money from you, I give it to her, income average is the same, it's unchanged. But what happens to the average health in the population? It goes up. Because it's not a linear relationship. What happens is here, this rich person loses this tiny amount of health from there to there, but this poor person gains this great amount of health. So the average health in the population goes up when you transfer income from the rich to the poor. Even though the average income doesn't change, when we equalize the income, the health goes up necessarily because of the curvilinear relationship. So maybe everything I told you so far today has been an artifact. Maybe everything I told you is simply because of this fundamental relationship, this declining marginal return relationship, this curve. Maybe it's unavoidable that when you have inequality in income, more inequality is going to have greater health. And it's got nothing to do with the new material conditions or the psychosocial stuff I've discussed. Is everyone with me still? Maybe it's just an artifact. Now this would not obtain in this situation. Here, if you took $100 away from a rich person and gave it to a poor person, average income would stay the same, but average health would stay the same as well. Because this person would decline by some amount and this person would rise by the same amount. So it's this shape of the curve that may cause this problem. Thus, if all that matters to health at the individual level is absolute income, and if the health-income relationship is nonlinear, as shown here, average health in the society will improve as average income increases, but average health will also improve as the inequality of income decreases. A community with more equal income will tend to have better average health than a community with more inequality. And this is called the absolute income hypothesis for explaining the inequality health relationship. And it's a mechanism that has to do with the individual level relationship between health and wealth. Okay? So a lot of people look at the data on inequality and they say, this is all that's going on. This basic relationship. It's got nothing to do with the neo-material or psychosocial explanations that we discussed earlier. And another note before I move on is that this is, of course, not static. Some of you are probably itching to point this out. There could be a dynamic change that might take place here so that a rich person might, if you take $100 away from him or her, might then change their behavior in some way, which makes their health even worse. So maybe if you tax the rich and give the money to the poor, their health might actually not behave in the fashion of this curve because they might get really depressed and commit suicide or start smoking or something. So it would be a moving target. These curves would shift in shape under different taxation regimes. But we can start with the statics before we move to the dynamics. Is this clear? Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat
This absolute income hypothesis. The absolute income hypothesis states that the explanation for the relationship between inequality and health has to do with the curvilinear relationship at the individual level between income and health. That because it's this kind of a curve, if you transfer money from the rich to the poor, health will, and making the society more equal, health will rise, but it's got nothing to do with the environment that's faced by the individuals, by relative deprivation, which we'll talk about next time. It's just an artifact of this relationship. It's a necessary consequence of this curved relationship at the individual level. Okay? Any other questions? So no doubt, in fact, the concavity in the relationship explains part of the what is going on here. So no doubt the concavity explains at least part of the population level association between inequality and health. That is, the individual level relation could explain the societal level relationship. So maybe what's happening at the individual level is what explains this relationship we observe when we go from place to place between inequality and health. But in fact, the association between income inequality and mortality, however, does in fact go beyond that which can be explained as a statistical artifact of individual level relationship between income and health and mortality. This graph shows results from an analysis based on 1990 data for the United States, 50 United States states, and two separate sets of 50 points are co-plotted. Each point in these scatter plots represents one of the 50 United States states, with the area of each circle proportional to that state's population. The red lines show the downward sloping relationship between inequality and health outcomes that would arise solely as a result of the concavity. So here we have the median share of state income, so it's a measure of inequality, and here's the mortality for 100,000 people. And this red line is downward sloping. It's not flat. There's a negative slope, and that's the slope that would have been observed simply because of the individual income hypothesis. That's the slope we would have observed. But that's not what we see. We see even more than that. We see a much steeper relationship between income inequality and health. And that steeper relationship shown on blue is probably the product of the new material explanation and the psychosocial explanations that I discussed earlier. So some part of the slope of the blue line is due simply to this artifact that I discussed at the end, or this feature that I discussed at the end, but not all of it. It turns out, in fact, that the association between income inequality and mortality is considerably stronger than can be accounted for by the concavity of the relationship at the individual level. Something else, in fact, must be going on, and we'll continue that next time. Are there any questions? Yeah, Rachel.
In the supermarket essay, I think they also bring up like political effect, or one of the essays they talk about political effect. That's why people see how that's different than the neo-material.
I don't remember exactly what you're talking about, but I would put the political effects. I mean, it's hard in terms of what you think of as political effects. So I would, yes, include them in the new material explanation, but they also can be an intermediary variable. So either you think of the public policies and politics of the state as a kind of new material effect on you. So you live in a state with good government or bad government, for example, and that can affect you, or a government that hates the poor. Or most in our society we revere the rich a lot, but we might vary in how much we revere the rich from place to place. In our society, we tend to be kind of nasty to the poor, but we might also vary from place to place in how nasty we are to the poor. So it may be that something about the politics of that state might be related to that, or instead of thinking, that you have air pollution is a material effect, and public politics, something about the political system, is a new material effect, and those both affect health in some way. You might think of the political thing as being causally prior to that, for example. So you might think of political factors result in failure to address air pollution, which then results in health. So the answer to your question, as I understand it, is that you could think of the kind of political regime in a state as either one of a set of neomaterial conditions, or you could think of it as the way the neomaterial conditions are translated into health. Yeah, what's your name?
Michaela.
Michaela.
In the same reading, the authors seem to suggest that new materials would be a better explanation, just in terms of influencing public policy, and I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, so he's touching on the issue we discussed earlier. I think he's summarizing the big literature. He's saying, yes, the psychosocial things happen. You don't like it when you go through first class and you're aware of first class and so forth. But really, that's only a part of the story, a small part. The real problem is the neomaterial conditions in the back of the plane. So he's saying what we really need to focus on is that. That's what he is arguing. And we'll come back next time to these relative standing issues and how that can affect you, how you can be harmed by hierarchy, for example. And I'm not saying, keep in mind, guys, like you guys often want to treat things as dichotomy. Either it's this or that. It's both. And they're saying that the new material, in their judgment, is the more important one in terms of explaining the relationship of how inequality gets mapped to health. Other questions? These are good questions. Okay, see you next time.